under the hood. It's our opportunity as a district to talk about the budget in very transparent ways, the pieces of the budget that we don't really talk about during the budget process. Again, my name is Brett Provenzano. Matt Stevens, who is the Assistant Superintendent for Business, will be doing most of the driving tonight because we're going to be talking about our revenues. Our Board of Education, we have, I think, Dr. Moritz is right over there from our Board of Education. They, again, each year develop goals, and one of the goals is to make sure that we are transparent in our process, making sure that we're fiscally responsible and sustainable as we move through and provide the education that our community expects and our students enjoy thoroughly. Today, again, we're going to be talking about our expenditures and how do we project revenues. It's going to be a brief, it's going to be a brief discussion or just an overview of what we talked about last week with our expenditures, and then we're going to talk about how do we pay for our programming through our revenues, talking about where the money comes and how do expenditures and revenues match up. Again, this is not a presentation of our budget. That will be happening as we go through our workshops and budget sessions, as I'll be talking about in a little bit. But again, this is directly connected to the goals of our budget process, and in particular, in addition to the school improvement and facilities goals, we have making sure that we keep long-term fiscal sustainability at the forefront of the budget process and focusing on being transparent and responsible to our community. Thank you again for coming. This is one of 12, the second of 12 interactions that we have with the community on the budget. And I like this slide because it talks about the budget process. It's not a one-time event that happens on May 20th. It's out and open for our community to engage with and learn from. Last week we talked about the budgeting infrastructure. Transportation has significant impacts on our expenditures. The instructional and non-instructional and technology also has an impact on the expenditure portion of our budget, along with our facilities, which includes custodial, maintenance, and grounds, utilities, and security. In particular, this stat always makes me think twice about how we have a living, dynamic organization with 1.2 million square feet, 8 school buildings, 4 administrative and support buildings, and over 300 acres to manage. That speaks volumes on how we need to upkeep it. If you go to any one of our schools, particularly our 612 buildings, they're in use. Right now we have a basketball game going on in the gymnasium, and Minerva DeLand could be popping with a concert. I know it was last night, standing room only, Minerva DeLand, and same thing for JP. There's activities going on in our buildings, and we're proud of that. Where does the money go? Again, here are mandates that we talked about, unfunded and underfunded mandates. And again, I'm not going to go through the list, but these are the things we talked about last week just to sort of get us back into the swing of things. These are the things that we're obligated to provide and honored, actually, so we can give the very best to our students and our families. All the way from transportation to supporting our English language learners, special ed services, academic intervention services. Now we have zero emission buses, and we have tons of records that we need to manage in the building, in the district, so we can share with the state to meet those mandates. Here's, again, list of expenditures. Again, our community's priorities talks about high levels of instructional support, school improvement initiatives, which involves curriculum and instruction, elective opportunities. We're proud of our elective opportunities. Art, music, world languages, advanced placement courses, college and career education, science, technology, engineering, art, and math labs at the K-5 level, where we are trying to build excitement into the future about STEAM, as we call it. Universal UPK, class sizes and teaming is very important to our community and our students, making sure that there's extra and co-curricular activities, clubs. We boast one of the highest interscholastic programs in Monroe County, and our students perform with so much class, style, and pride. Mental health is also very important to our community and Board of Education. How do we know our students are successful? I think that was a question that was asked. And this is something that we've really been trying to dig in over the past several years. How do we know? Well, our students tell us, right? Well, we do exit surveys where we're always asking the students what are their favorite parts, how can we continue to do better. 43 students in 2020-24 received a New York State Seal of Biliteracy in 8 different languages. I'm proud of that. It's tops in Monroe County, 78 students in National Honor Society, 15 students in National Technical Honor Society. Again, our students are performing with 18, they participate in 140 courses offered at FHS, including 18 advanced placement classes, 110 electives, and 11 course areas. Again, pretty expansive. Students have opportunities here, and they take advantage of those, and they fill those seats. Like 23 interscholastic sports teams, again, because the classroom is just not where the learning occurs. It occurs on the playing fields. It also includes on the stages. Again, our music program is renowned throughout the county. Feedback that we get on our music program is something we're very proud of, and all the awards and accolades with music and art is continually showcased each year. Our New York State testing and exams that we take each year, we use that to assess our curriculum, and more than ever, we're aligning our curriculum so our data can become more useful to us, so we can always assess our programming to make sure that we're doing best for our students and our staff have the right tools and resources. We use SEL screeners so we could check in on the social emotional well-being of our students. We use the Youth at Risk Behavior Survey, again, more data points. And we have great participation in BOCES CTE programming. Another element that indicates that we're on the right track is FHS was named College Board AP School Honor Roll in 2020-24. It's a consecutive years that this occurred. JP and Martha Brown have been recognized as schools to watch in middle school. Only 3% of the nation's middle schools, or less than 3% of the nation's middle school, have this designation. Again, another sign of excellence. JP was nominated for and won the 2020-24 Rochester's Community's Choice Awards victory for Best Local Public School. And FHS is a National Blue Ribbon School, and that is ranked annually as a high-performing school. Again, these are touch points to get a sense on how we're doing programmatically. We also, and I'm very proud of this, are starting to delve into what we call our data dashboard. It's a deeper look into data, again, to assess our program and to make sure that we're making our investments or making the most of our investments. You're going to see us talk more about performance on New York State assessments, particularly in grades 3 through 8, and on track in academics. How are our students performing academically, particularly in the secondary level? Are they on track for success using indicators such as attendance, performance on exams, and we track students' progress in those areas. Reduction in chronic absenteeism. We know that students need to get to school. We know just like Fairport, nationally, Fairport struggles with this in some instances, so we have an aggressive campaign to get students back to school because that's where we feel they belong and that's where the learning occurs. So they can be the best they can be, not just today, but tomorrow into the future. And again, our 4-year graduation rate is on our data dashboard that the board has invested in, and we're using that as a way to understand how we're doing. And I think somebody asked that question last week, and I just wanted to address it. All these are ways that we assess how we're doing. The data points, we're trying to hone in on them and use them in meaningful ways so we can inform our curriculum, inform our teaching, so we can provide the best programming and make sure we're getting value with our investments. So that was a quick recap, and I answered a question that was part of the question comments here about program evaluation and how we make sure our investments are paying dividends for us. Mr. Stevens is going to come on and talk about revenues, and we'll move along.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Provenzano. So next part, we last week talked about the expenses. This week we'll talk about the revenues and the different sources of revenue that the school has. So here, just a quick summary. Major revenue sources, property tax levy. and payments in lieu of taxes, state aid, which ranges from our foundation aid to building aid, transportation aid, BOCES aid, just to name a few, and then Monroe County sales tax. So school districts in Monroe County are one of few in which the county shares in sales tax collected with the school district. So that's a big piece of revenue. I've had the opportunity to work in other districts where counties have taken away those funds. They don't offer those funds. So we're really grateful and thankful as a school district that we have that agreement and that sharing with Monroe County schools. And then other revenue sources, tuition, that's non-resident tuition, such as foster placement, or if there are staff with children attending, there's a tuition cost for that. Facility equipment use, that would be any of the usage of outside groups using our facilities. Admissions to events like athletic events or music, drama, some of the different productions that we put on there. Interest earnings, federal Medicaid, prior year refunds. For example, we receive E-rate reimbursement, which is a program that reimburses for portions of technology purchases, whether it's telecom or internet access and connections. And then interfund transfers. So here, if we have a transfer being supported, for example, from our debt service fund to help cover a local share of debt, that would be an example of an interfund transfer. And then use of fund balance and reserves in terms of what do we assign from surplus funds of a prior year to help fill any revenue gap for the following school year. Oh, there it is. So here's just kind of a breakdown, the dollar bill again. We saw it on the expense side. Here's what it looks like on the revenue side. Again, the largest two pieces, property tax levy and state aid, those making up close to 90% of the entire revenue budget. And then we have our fund balance and reserves, sales tax, other revenue, interfund transfers for debt service. So that's the quick breakdown in terms of where our revenue sources come from. And here's what it looks like historically on a graph over the years. So top to bottom is how the type of analysis breaks down as well. So here you can see, again, the blue bar being the largest, and then the gray bar at the bottom for the state aid being the next largest. Overall, you've seen some growth over the years. The growth primarily has been related to growth in state aid. So there was some phase in of foundation aid, and then any expense-driven aids that we've seen increase. And then as it relates to property taxes, that has been growth in the levy over the years. So those are probably two of the main pieces where we've seen growth over the years in terms of our revenue sources. We have seen some growth in interest earnings because after, during pandemic, we saw rates rise. We've seen interest earnings as low as, in the past 10 years since I've been here, as low as under 100,000 and as high as over 2 million. So we have seen drastic changes in what those earnings have come to actually look like for the district. This is the budget to actual in terms of revenues over the years. And you can see historically, we have the actual revenues have come in slightly higher than budget, approximately 2 to 3%, depending on the year. And like I said, one of those pieces could be interest earnings. And that's a large volatile piece of revenue that we see in the district, that if those revenues we've seen come in higher than in previous in terms of the budget as a whole. So that would be probably one of the main pieces that we've seen in earnings. And then perhaps sometimes we see prior year revenue. We may have expenses that we've had to utilize general fund for in previous years before capital project funding comes through, and then we have to refund the general fund when we have those funds available for the capital improvement project. So sometimes that may cross fiscal years as well. Those are two examples of where sometimes we would see one-time revenues hit during the fiscal year that may or may not be there the following year. So taking a look at those, we had a stop point here. Looking at the different streams of revenue that we have as a district, looking at those on a yearly basis. Any thoughts on the proportion of the revenue streams to the whole? Just wanted to provide an opportunity as we kind of move through each one of these. Yes?
So this is a lot of data, and maybe there's people here that can understand that the first time. But did you get feedback later on that said, hey, remember when we met? Because this is the second time you folks have done this. It would seem to me that you almost have a process where people are looking at this, or maybe going home and talking to a partner and say, look at this chart. I don't understand this. And all of a sudden somebody says, well, what about this? Is there any kind of mechanism that allows people, or is it just the normal communication meetings that you have with the board, where people could have an opportunity to say, well, you know, on this chart, I didn't understand that one colored line. Where do you give the community an opportunity to say, that was great data? Now let's break it down so that mere mortals can understand this. We don't have our MBA from Morgan.
So I'll jump in, and then Mr. Stevens can continue. But that's what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a culture where there's more than 1, 2, 3, 4 community members come in and talk about this, right? And last year, it wasn't as robust as this, right? And we have some staff members here. We appreciate you being here. Thank you for coming. So that's the culture that we're trying to create, because we want to talk about this and we want there to be understanding. And you're right, there's workshops that occur where people can tune in and this is talked about, and there's board meetings and public comments that people can come in. There's private meetings that we've had in the past with concerned or interested citizens. So we're trying to create that culture to bring people in. And we're hoping that you'll tell a friend, and then next year, continue to build upon it. Because you're right, it's not a one and done. This is my 10th year going through this, and I'm always learning something new. And we have a great business official and team. They'll talk about it all day long. Look how excited he is. So, Mr. Stevens, I don't know, you want to add to that?
No, I mean, it's a.
No, thanks.
Yeah.
No, it's great. Like Mr. Provenzano mentioned, trying to do more of this interactive work to, try to answer questions as best we can. As we go through this, try to break down things a little bit more to carve out what state aid looks like, or how does the tax levy come about. Some of those different pieces to try to dig in a little bit deeper. Always our efforts to try to educate and help folks understand a little bit more and answer questions they may have. So,
because it just strikes me as if in all this data, there's a question in there. I haven't found it yet. I just, and maybe other people can have more opportunity to think about it.
Well, the thing,
with all this data, there's got to be some questions that we can stump them on. In a general way. I mean, just to make everybody think a little bit. That's all. I just can't do that on the first go. Is all.
fair question. I would also say, you take a look at our state aid, and you hear us always talking about this idea of foundation aid. That's our largest source of revenue. And the board does tremendous amounts of advocacy. And I believe last week we had a conversation with our legislators in Monroe County talking about foundation aid. They know that we need consistent foundation aid, because if you look at the chart, it's one of our greatest sources of revenue. And in the past, they've played games with that. They've taken money away, then all of a sudden they brought it back, and now they flattened it out. And it's hard to have a predictable budget without predictable foundation aid. And I think in March, the board's also going along with myself to Albany, right, in advocating to our legislators, lawmakers, and SED, so we can continue to try to have consistent flow. And I know that your group does that, and I know that our teachers union has a legislative breakfast as well, and we try to align our advocacy points.
Great, thank you. And there's more slides, so I'm sure we can get a question as we move through. So where's the money come from? Again, talked before about the tax levy. This year, I always put this in each presentation, even through the budget presentation process with the board, just to remind folks about how do we have to calculate the tax levy. And there's a limit imposed several years ago, what is known as a 2% cap. Now, within the formula that school districts have to follow, there are some exclusion amounts that fall through here. What's exclusion mean? It means it's a dollar amount, a local share that's allowed to be raised through taxes that may exceed the 2%. So it's a formula-based piece. One example of that would be the local share cost of voter-approved capital improvement projects. So that annual cost each year. Another example is related to the purchase of buses for use in student transportation. So the difference between the cost and the aid that's coming in is allowed to be added on to the formula within the tax cap calculation. So those are just a couple of different examples. There are pieces that flow into the formula, such as looking at the growth in the tax base. So when there's a growth in the tax base, it's on a year lag from last year to this year, then that becomes a multiplier in the formula. So if it went up 0.4%, then that 1.004 becomes a multiplier on the formula as well. So it's a multi-step process that we have to go through, schools have to go through, submit the information to the state by March 1st, and that becomes the cap in which schools may go up to. That only requires an approval by voters for a budget approval of 50% plus one vote. So if schools are overriding the tax cap, it's communicated and clear, and that requires a greater than a 60% approval rate of the vote itself. So that's just a quick summary of how the tax cap plays into levy calculation. So there is some management over what schools can do in terms of raising funds through the tax levy. Yes?
I want to see if I can word this properly. There was a time years ago where we used to get a check from New York State because our board kept the tax rate below whatever, and that stopped.
Yep.
Why?
State ended the program.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it was basic that it was a program from the state reimbursing taxpayers in local communities when the municipality stayed at the tax levy limit or below.
Okay, so then what? Okay, does that mean that then they can do whatever?
Nope, we still have to stay within the tax levy limit or below.
Okay.
During that time, schools could have gone over the tax cap and been over that and required that greater than 60% approval. That just would have meant that the community would not have received that reimbursement. Fairport,
But you still have to.
we still have to abide by that.
Somebody's still watching over you.
Absolutely.
So, Mr.
Yeah.
Stevens, if we decide, if we have to go over the tax cap, what, can you talk?
It would require, if we propose to go over the tax cap during budget development for voter approval, we'd be required to have an approval rate of greater than 60%. So it's not just a straight, one greater than 50%, it's 60% approval.
Which we have not
Required.
done,
We have
or the
not
board
done
has not considered that.
Great question, you remember that
Yeah,
program.
I remember every time I don't get a check.
I will add, there's one other piece in here that we did have an exclusion for 24-25, is not placed for 25-26, but it's when the state, the contribution percentage increases for employers to the pension systems. So the employer retirement system and the teacher retirement system. When the growth in the percent increase is greater than 2%, school districts are able to exclude that difference that's over 2%. So for example, if it went up from 13% to 16%, schools could take 1%, multiply that by the salaries for that pension system, and that part's excluded under the calculation. I've only seen that twice in the past 15 years where that growth in the rate has been greater than 2%. Here's a historical look over the past 5 years, our budget percent change, tax levy percent change, and then tax rate percent change. And then just a small graph below that, kind of outlining the difference in growth. So over the years, we've seen slight increases in the budget. That would, again, relate primarily to salaries and benefits being a big piece of that. In some years, we've had oncoming debt, where perhaps on the revenue side, we've seen increase in building aid. Those are some of the different pieces that have gone into the growth in budget. And then the tax levy percent increase Here you can see over the years, it's been ranged from 2.13 to up to 2.98. Those have all been within the tax cap at the levy limit, so we have not gone over. 23, 24, some correlation there. You see a growth in the budget of over 5%. You see a 2.98% growth in the tax levy. That would be because we had some oncoming debt. So you had some debt, some building aid, and then that difference is the local share that would allow the growth in the levy. Yes?
Am I reading this correctly? Over the 5 years, the school budget is over doubled?
No, budget has not doubled. That's been the percent growth in the budget.
Got it. Okay. Thank
Yep. Yeah, so the school budget for this year is about just under 160 million for the general fund. So then the growth in that budget, if it were 4 or 5%, would be between 5 and 7 million. Just the growth, well, not necessarily, it's year to year. So it's twice the percentage of the growth in 2021, but depending on the budget to budget piece, again, there'd be other factors that would be taken into play there. So the levy you can see in green, and then in blue you see the tax rate change. Now we did in my 10 years here, we did have something a little more unique happen in 24-25, is that there was a reduction in the tax base. Now that has not typically happened. Each year you can see the tax levy growth, and this goes back to our conversation last week when we talked about the relationship between the tax base and the tax levy growth and the tax rate growth change. Historically, we've seen the growth in the tax base higher than years prior, which is why the rate percent increase is less than the tax levy percent increase. Now, in 24-25, this is a residual effect of the equalization rate not keeping up with what the state expects of the town of Perrington for assessments. So right now, we are, for 24-25, it's lower, it's about 62% in terms of the equalization rate, which means it's saying that homes are underassessed by 38%. That would be, we've seen commercial properties come in and argue and fight assessments because they're not assessed the same as residential properties. So most of the reduction in tax base has been related to commercial property as a whole. That flows through the formula in terms of the tax rate calculation itself. Any questions on, it's a lot of information on this slide. Any questions here before I jump forward? Oh, I did. So here's the formula for the tax cap calculation. Like I said, multi-step process, prior year levy times that growth in the tax base from prior year, plus payments in lieu of taxes. So we add them in and take them away. So it's essentially the difference that gets excluded in the process. The exemptions from the prior year, capital exemption, and then that about the middle of the way down where you see allowable levy growth factor, the lesser of 2% or the growth in CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that's the 2% cap that's imposed by the state. So we've seen years where that growth has been less than 2%. So we've seen it at 1.6%, which means that's the growth that can be multiplied there. We've seen growth in CPI at 7 or 8%. It's capped at 2. So that's where there's that management at the state level for how school districts may calculate their tax levy increase for the following year to be at or below the cap. And then we are able to add on, you can see the capital levy for current year. That's where we're able to add on the local share of debt, service payments for capital improvement projects, and the local cost of buses, so the bus purchases.
So all years are not created equal, right? Because if you don't have exclusions coming in or revenues coming in or coming due, then you're going to have a different calculation. So sometimes it's not a one for one, and that you can't say, well, why is it, up so much from one year to the next? Because there's variables that we have to deal with.
Yep, correct. And here you can see there was this was the pension exclusion that we had in the employee retirement system. It equated to about $15,000 in exclusion. So it's not massive or large, but it is part of the formula. Yes.
Maybe a little bit out of scope, but if CPI goes up that dramatically, I imagine macroeconomically, like, things are not good. And so if the school's capped at 2%, I imagine their buying power falls behind considerably. Has it happened?
There are challenges. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we've seen costs of materials, supplies, those types of things rise, and we're still capped.
Among all of them,
Yes.
probably it's the most
Yeah,
recent.
paper products have been up quite a bit. That's a good example. So we've seen that growth, and still with CPI having it capped.
Another question over here.
Do you know what the largest properties are that are getting payments in lieu of taxes in the school district?
Not off the top of my head. I could reach out to you and give you the information, but there are it's varying properties. I was just looking at it today. Some in the village related to the cannery area, because they had some improvements there. Some senior living establishments. That's where we've seen. Those are some that have the exclusions. Qualitrol was one that had fallen off, actually, became fully taxable after the 10-year time period in which they were allowed to be on the, have a pilot agreement in place. Those are just to name a few of them. Woodlands at Stonebrook, that's one. I'm just picturing my spreadsheet. Yeah, Woodlands at Stonebrook, property on Egypt Road as well for some senior living that went up a few years back. So those are kind of a couple examples. It's been we've seen a lot of the senior living pieces being pilot agreements.
Does the Monroe County IDA talk to you about this before it happens? Find out after it's a done deal? How does that work?
So there'll be a hearing at the town. So we usually attend the hearing to listen in and see what is in place. A lot of times, in my experience and time here, any new pilots that have come on have been undeveloped property, of which maybe we're seeing $9,000 in taxes coming in. So in those spots, we're actually seeing an increase in revenue that's taking some burden off of the tax levy as a whole. Mostly that's what I've seen come in as a whole over the years. The village has a separate process where in their own IDA, different than the counties, and typically they work through that. Again, we get the information to attend hearings, to listen in. Usually I'll connect with any questions I have. I may connect with the village reps or county reps just to understand more about the process and what they have, what they're proposing. We always want to make sure, at least in those agreements, that the school is getting a share of the funds. So that's one of the main pieces to be sure we're actually getting paid if the property is going to go through that process. So, yep. Good question, though. Yeah, it's up. To give you an idea, we receive between those pilots anywhere between 900,000 to, I believe next year projection is about $1 million. So it's a decent amount. That's helping. It's over 1.5%. It's about 1.5% on the tax levy as a whole. So here is, I know it's small in terms of the writing, but picture those are the Monroe County schools across there. And highlighted in green, the darker green is Fairport. So this is the tax levy per pupil. So looking at the students, how do we compare across the county? So you can see we are, generally speaking, in that mid-range with a fair amount of schools, not the highest. I believe if you look at that, Pittsford is the highest. And why could that be? They may receive less support in state aid. So in terms of the tax levy, that would be a big piece of revenue for Pittsburgh. So there are different variables that go into play here. What is the, what's the local wealth? What are they receiving in aid from the state? Could play into the support of the tax levy as well. So that's what that looks like across the county. And then full value tax rates. Now, here's where I talked before about the equalization rate. On this bar, you can see Fairport is a little bit lower than some of the other districts, kind of in that, mid to low range as a whole. I have down in the notes, because it's important as we look at our tax bills, that the full value tax rate shown here for 2023-24 is $17.18. Now, on the tax bill, it'll show $24.20. That's because Fairport Central School District is in one township, being the town of Perrington. So the way the county runs the bill through the system is just at that higher rate. But if you look at your tax bill, you'll see an assessed value, and then you'll see a full market value. So that full market value, you'll see that 71% on the bill as well, because they'll share. That full market value is your assessed value divided by that 71%. So in essence, the state is pulling the data from the full value tax rate. It would be raising, if the state ran through the tax base and said instead of being at 4 billion, it's at 5 billion, it would collect the same exact money as a whole. So it wouldn't change anything there for the district. Yes?
So someone mentioned last time about, she heard from Bill Birdie that we're gonna be getting assessed next year or something like that.
Yep.
I think it was the lady
No,
there.
she works at the assessor's office.
Yeah.
And so when they figure out all the budget things, just because your house comes in, let's say $100,000 higher, they may lower it to the actual, so as far as, let me get the wording right. The equalization, so you're not getting taxed on that full value, your equalization will probably be lower. Is that?
Yep, so what they'll do,
You may be able to explain it better than I can.
you're absolutely on the right track. So you're on the right track. When they update the assessments, they do the reassessment and get to 100%, then this chart, I'll no longer have to have that bottom line on there that says the full value true rate is 1718, and it says 2420 on your bill because of the 71% equalization rate. Both those numbers will be the same exact number, which ultimately would be that 17, 18, or $18 where it lands in a couple of years. So you're absolutely right. It's, as a whole, it's just going to take that tax rate and true it up. Did I answer the
Yeah.
question and what you're looking for? Yeah, it's not going to mean that the school district or town or county is going to collect more money from taxpayers. It's still going to be at that tax levy. Yes?
So the assessment goes up, but the tax rate goes down?
Yep, when the tax base goes up for the whole district, the tax rate drops.
Okay.
You got it. Yeah, here it's already showing it. Like I said, you won't see it lower than that 1718 because it's already taking into account that the town is not assessed at full market value. Properties in the town are not assessed at full market value. Yes?
When was the last assessment?
1819. So 2018-19 fiscal year is when we saw the last assessment in the town of Perrington.
It's coming.
Wow,
Yeah, so we've
big number.
seen it drop. Went to 93%, then 80%, then 71, and now 62. So we have seen it drop about 10 percentage points each year. I think it stayed flat for 1 year at the 93. For 2 years, I'm sorry, stayed flat. Great questions. Appreciate the thought feedback. Now jumping to state aid. So getting off the tax levy and rate, and now looking at state aid. So like Mr. Provenzano said before, foundation aid is the largest piece of operating aid that schools receive. It's unrestricted aid to fund our programs as a whole. Enacted back in 2007, 2008, and then distributed based on complex formula at the state level. So it has different factors that go into play, from enrollment to wealth, and just to name a couple. We saw there's been some iterations at the state level where, when that was enacted, there was some time in which the foundation aid was not phased in over the years. So school districts had a calculation that said, here's what your foundation aid should be, but here's what you're going to receive the following year, to keep it simple in that case. We also saw years in which the state, due to the state budget, there was some funds taken away from school districts. It was called, it was once called deficit reduction assessment, and then the more recent piece was the gap elimination adjustment. So what happened was, if Fairport was supposed to receive $27 million in foundation aid, ignoring the phase-in piece, because the phase-in piece may have been higher at perhaps at one point in time, we were underfunded according to the formula by $5-6 million each year. On top of that, instead of it being 32 million, we were receiving 27 million. And on top of that, we had a gap elimination adjustment of another 5 or 6 million. And then what happened over the years as advocacy efforts took place for schools, we started to see a increase, we'll say a reduction in the gap elimination adjustment, which basically meant that we'll give you 27 or $28 million next year, but we still weren't to the 32. And then we will receive 30 million the following year, still not to the 32. So there were several years that schools as a whole were underfunded based on the formula. And then also just trying to get back to where the dollar was reading without the gap elimination adjustment. So when that happened, we saw larger increases in aid for a revenue standpoint that helped support the budgets, still didn't have us to our full funded piece. And then back 4 years ago, there was a change in the phase-in of the foundation aid, and then for schools, we were phased in over a 3-year period to where we should have been funded. So now we are at our funding marks according to the formula. So in those 3 years, we saw some substantial increases in aid to get us to where we needed to be, and it varied by district. There may have been some districts across the state that were, based on the formula, already fully funded or overfunded because of some of the factors in the calculation, such as enrollment or wealth or some of those different pieces. Fairport, we were not there at the time, so we did see the increases in revenue over those 3 years. But once those 3 years finished up, then we're back to what's our increase in foundation aid. So we weren't seeing that great increase in aid because we were now funded up to our amount. So that's kind of a story in terms of foundation aid and the historical piece of that and how it's worked over the years. Expense-driven aids are just what they say. They're based on a formula set at the state level where we have expenses in, if we had expenses in 2024-25, such as on transportation-related expenses or BOCES aidable items, were aided the following school year. So if we spend, put the formulas or the percentage rates here, lists a few of the different expense-driven aids. We are aided on public excess cost and private excess cost. What is that? That's aid on our services for students in special education programs that could be privately placed outside of the district in private placements or educated publicly in district or at BOCES programs. So we receive aid back on those services the following school year. And you can see there is an expected local contribution for costs there, 48,000 related to public excess cost and 17,000 related to private excess cost. And then our transportation aid ratio is 71.8%, BOCES aid 67.7%, and then building aid is 77.7%. Those are our 2023-24 aid ratios. They will vary each year, again, as they roll through the state's formula, and then we're aided based on those percent rates. So, what's it mean? I think we talked a little bit about it last time in terms of the expense side, but if we were to spend, for every dollar we spend on a BOCES aid service, we're going to get back 67.7 cents on that the following year. So the local cost is less impacted. And we do look at school district to see what can we maximize for shared services so that we can create these efficiencies within the budget as a whole. So that's a breakdown between the budgeting for state aid and how that works for schools. Yes?
Just to get into something totally useless. The state aid we get, is that determined by how many days school is actually in session? Is that the state aid thing? Is that why, we can't do school closing more than 3 times a year?
You got it. Yeah, depends on what the school calendar, and it can vary year to year. Depends on what the calendar has built in for emergency closing days. But schools are required to have 180 days, instructional days. 4 of those 180 days can be superintendent's conference days, so those qualify. So 176 instructional days with 4 superintendent's conference days keeps us at the law. And then at the secondary level, Regents days, according to the Regents schedule, also count. So if we were to exceed the number of closing days we had built into the school calendar, we would either have to look for an additional day. Sometimes it could be a holiday break. It could be maybe we had 5 conference days scheduled and we're going to take one away and make that an instructional day because we can't count more than 4 to try to make sure we've hit that 180 days. Otherwise, it starts to be a day deduction on the foundation aid, and we don't want to land there.
Is that why New York State stays with the February recess, just in case they need extra days?
No.
They can take it out of that?
No, they're unrelated. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, not related to the school calendar itself. Not, yeah, not typically. Mr. Provenzano will laugh when he knows we've had this conversation many times, but February break really probably won't give you the opportunity to take back a day because unless we had a real terrible winter up to February break, otherwise a lot of these spill over into February, March timeframe before you actually can identify whether or not you're going to land short. So a lot of times we have an April conference day maybe that could help us if need be, but when we publicize the calendar, we do indicate that there are some days down there if needed. If we exceed our number of closing days that we've built in, we may need to take back these days here. So we
Could you just add a day to the calendar?
cannot go past the Regents rating day in June. So cannot count any more instructional days past that. Great questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And then a few years back, the state added an hours requirement to the calendar, which means schools have to get both 180 days in plus a required number of hours at each level, elementary being 900 and secondary being 990. So we have to get 990 hours over those 180 days for grades 7 through 12 and 900 for grades K through 6. So both play in. So in some cases, we would need 182 days or 183 days to make sure we hit the hours.
Well, during Regents, now is that considered the 180?
It counts, yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Then the next question is, why was it a few years ago, Regents ended up being pushed back a whole week?
I don't, in terms of the state, so a lot of times it's just based on the calendar, was it?
Yeah, it's the state.
They said it.
It was always because Regents was at a certain time, and I just remember because of substituting so much.
Okay.
I just remembered that it's like all of a sudden, this week, when we normally have Regents, no, it's gonna be the following week.
Hmm.
It's like, so it pushed it, so people were getting out of school for summer break.
Every calendar
Yeah.
is different. Like,
can be a little
there's different holidays, falls on different days. So I've seen it in different spots earlier, like you're mentioning. Lately, it's been the last week of June.
Yeah, and they've,
But before,
yeah, it usually runs, so it can depend a little bit. So we've gone as late as June 26th in the calendar for the last day with rating.
Earlier, yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the Board of Regents said, oh, we're gonna do Regents a week later.
Got it.
Mr. King, we got a question from
Yes.
Mr. King.
I find these overheads to be helpful for someone that doesn't have a lot of background. Now, I don't know if from a process point of view, you folks decided you're gonna just show us the data in terms of the overhead, but it would be, in retrospect, the next time we all get together, it would be nice to have that slide here so that when you're all done, I can look and say, oh, this is what he was talking about. Rather than try to remember those points.
So this information will be on our website. So we're gonna put this presentation, both of these presentations, the expenditures and revenues on the website. And this slide also will be, slides like this will be part of the budget process when we do presentations in March, February and March on budget process. So they'll be accessible, but yes, for this presentation for the future, we could give you a hard copy.
I mean, in a sense, you've captured me for 2 hours tonight. If you want to give me some of that information,
Great.
here as well as on the screen.
Great.
So I can walk away. Now, you're right, I can look it up, and
Yeah, you want it right now, though. You're here. Yep.
I'd rather have it here to think about it as you go on to the next slide. I'll be looking back at this one, thinking about, well, what the hell is expense-driven aids and whatever those
Yeah.
things. Just to give me a chance to think about some stuff, that's all.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sounds great. So here's a look at what the governor comes out with a proposal, budget proposal in January. And this is a quick snapshot summary of what that proposal does for school aid, and then a little bit more in terms of how does that relate to Fairport. So here you can see overall a 4.8% increase in school aid under the governor's proposal, or $1.7 billion. 1.46 billion of that is related to the increase in foundation aid. Again, that largest operating aid for school districts. In the proposal, it has a due minimum increase of 2%. So, like I said before, some school districts are already overfunded according to the formula. This at least holds them harmless from a decrease in aid and gives them a minimum increase of 2% on that piece. So overall, as it relates to Fairport, it's a increase of about $641,000. So Fairport received a 2% minimum increase. Based on the formula, if running, we would have only received a $159,000 increase. So so we were one of the districts that, now that we're fully phased in, we're one of those districts that, because of that declining enrollment that we talked about last week, we see an impact here on foundation aid. So it did benefit Fairport in terms of our increase. I talk about budget to budget increase because of $490,000. That's because last year, when the budget was final, we were already through all of our process. There was a formula change that was adopted through the state budget that resulted in Fairport receiving no increase in aid for 2024-25 in foundation aid. Basically, we were held harmless because had the formula run, we would have got a reduction in aid. We were already through our whole process. Sometimes that happens with schools, and I already had the budgeted increase in there based on the governor's proposal back in January. And then after April 1 when it was adopted, we saw that number less than what we had planned. So in terms of actual cash coming into us from 24-25 to 25-26, that'll be up the $641,000, but budgetarily it'll only show a budget increase of $490,000. Here's some of the different pieces proposed in the formula. 2% increase. There was a study that took place over the past year by the Rockefeller Institute, and they had some recommendations in terms of how to update the formula a little bit that hasn't been updated since back in 2007-8. Some of the different data points you see there, the census poverty data, free and reduced price lunch data, replaced our expense-based aids, still staying in line with the formulas, proposed to fully fund them based on such formulas. And as we look at the aid runs, they base the information on data schools submit. So I date myself, but I go back many years when there were some proposals by the governor that said, we will cap your state aid for the expense-based aids at whatever the governor's proposal states, or the calculation off your actual expenses, whichever number lands to be less. So schools are always typically a little cautious to be conservative in the estimates. We know where the numbers should be in terms of our budget projections because we're analyzing that data. We're projecting the real expenses to see what that'll land at for the following fiscal year to calculate the aid. So I always say the aid runs could be a little inflated based on those pieces, and then we make sure that we true it up to what we truly project to spend as a district. And then here, where it lands for us is we have about a $1.46 million decrease in the expense-based aids. Now, seems alarming. However, $1 million is a decrease in debt, offset by there's $1 million decrease in a debt payment on the expense side. So that, just $1 million of that alone is a wash between the revenue and expense. That's why I said that can vary a little bit each year in terms of how those play out. And then There's a $400,000 decrease related to a one-time budgeted revenue from the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York to purchase a zero-emission bus in 2024-25. So that was a one-time revenue for current year. That's not budgeted for next year because, again, the expense side within the general fund budget, there's not a zero-emission bus budgeted in the general fund budget for next year. So of that 1.46, 1.4 million is related to those two pieces. So still in line, again, with seeing some growth in the transportation expense aid. BOCES aid will land about where we are current year, maybe up a little bit, but if we had one-time expenses that took place 2 years ago, we would have had a one-time revenue bump in the 24-25 that may not be there in 25-26. So again, we look at those, carefully analyze them to be sure that we're budgeting accordingly. Questions on I know it's a lot of information. Took me many years just to continue to analyze this data and understand it, but that's how we look through budgeting for state aid. And now back to charts. So these, a lot of these you do have in your packets, but here's a breakdown of our state aid history. The basic formula aid and lottery aid, what's included in those pieces, that's the funding source from the state. A lot of folks have asked me over the years, don't we get money from the lottery? Yes, school districts receive money from the lottery. It's essentially how the state is funding some of the different aid categories of which we receive, such as building aid, transportation aid, right? You don't see separate categories for those. So those are rolled up into the basic formula and lottery aid combined between those two pieces. And then you can see the BOCES aid, tuition and transportation for students with disabilities. And then we receive what are called instructional material aid. They're fairly small, but textbook aid is about a little over $300,000 for the district, and it's based off of a per pupil calculation to the state that we're capped at. So that's $58.25 per pupil that we receive aid for textbook purchases. We receive aid for computer software purchases, hardware purchases, all of which are capped at different calculations on a per pupil basis. So in order to receive that aid, though, we need to spend that dollar amount or greater to make sure we've maximized that aid. If we spend less, they don't give it to us. So they'll only give you what you spend. Here, so I talked about the phase-in of the foundation aid formula. So on this graph, you can see over the past couple of years, a little bit more of an increase of the overall bars themselves. And a lot of that is related to the phase-in of the foundation aid to get us to our fully funded amount based on the formula. Those years that we see that phase-in are 21-22, 22-23, and then the next bar, data not available through the state to extract it in some of these charts, 23-24 would be our final year of phase-in. So you'll see another jump there. 24-25, we would see that bar being flat between the basic formula lottery aid pieces there. So that's as we monitor that over the years. We look at budget on the expense side. How can we support revenues in terms of reserves, fund balance, all those different pieces as a whole. Yes.
I guess it was during the pandemic, the school district was put, because the schools had to close down, the school district was put in a position where they had to provide Chromebooks to all the students. Okay, is that still happening every year? Because I noticed, like, computer labs are done, computers in the library are done. Do students still get Chromebooks?
Yes, they do. Yep.
Okay.
So we have a replacement plan for the Chromebooks. It's mostly Chromebooks. There's iPads at the lower levels, K1, K2, thank you. K2 for iPads, and then Chromebooks from grades 3 through 12. So we do stagger our replacements.
Okay, so when the seniors graduate, those Chromebooks go with them?
No, they stay ours.
Come back?
Yep, they are the district's Chromebooks.
Okay, and who pays for those? Is that part of state aid?
That's part of actually BOCES aid, so we make those purchases through BOCES, and then we receive back aid on those the following year. So we work really hard. It doesn't always land perfect, but we work really hard to try to keep that stable so that we know our local share cost each year from the purchase minus the aid. Yep, great question. We do that for copiers, computers, Chromebooks, because there is a shelf life on these devices, and they break too, right?
I didn't know if when the students graduated, I didn't know if they just kept them.
Oh, no,
or
yeah.
I just wanted to make sure they were coming back.
They come back to us. Yep, any of those pieces are coming back to us. Just another look at the foundation aid over time, and I have 2025, 26 in here. This is the budget side as compared to the actual. So here in 24, 25 to 25, 26, you see where that $400,000 difference is between those two pieces. And for 23, 24, you can see budget a little bit lower. We did receive a little bit more in foundation aid that year because there was some money linked to high impact tutoring that when the budget was final, actually came to school districts as an unrestricted portion of foundation aid, not a required expense, and show us you spent it to get the money. So that was a piece where we saw it the other way around, where we received more aid than what was projected through the governor's proposal. And now we'd expect that to level out a little bit more based on the fact that the money's fully phased in according to the formula. Unless we saw some large changes in our factors that go in, we would expect it to continue on that, just kind of slight increase. Yes?
Speaking of factors, do you know why there was such a discrepancy that caused the staging to go into place?
I'm sorry, say it again. Caused them to phase in the funds?
Yes.
Oh, it was continued advocacy efforts by all constituents, from superintendents to boards, business officials, that pushed it to get.
What was the basis of the discrepancy between the district and the government there?
It chose not to phase in the aid based on the formula. So there was actually some legal matters in the past there was a campaign for fiscal equity, some of those pieces to fight to get it phased in. So there continued to be a back and forth in terms of we're not required to phase it in, and schools pushing to get it phased in. So ultimately, it got to the point where it was agreed to be phased in over the years. Yep. Here is just a little bit from a regional standpoint where we compared to other districts. So I just grabbed a few surrounding districts to show, where we land compared to them related to state aid. Again, it's going to vary a little bit. It could be size of district, could be number of students. But one thing to take away here as a whole is, as it relates to the makeup of each district's aid, very similar as a whole. Right, we see the basic formula and lottery aid being the two biggest pieces, and then just depending on the district, they could have different pieces running through BOCES. They could have the textbook, computer software, library material aid. Those are, again, smaller portions of the overall aid coming in. You can sometimes not even really see them at the bottom. But just to kind of take away, for us, we're receiving, over, almost 45, 50 million in state aid to help support the budget. Now, this is, I believe this is the last slide talking about the revenue and the aid. We remember during the pandemic, the state came out with, or the federal government came out with what was called, more commonly known as stimulus funding. So some federal support to help school districts move through the pandemic. It was funded from a couple different programs, one of which was called the American Rescue Plan, and then there was the Coronavirus Relief, Reimbursement Relief Supplementary Act. They may have got that a little bit wrong, but those are the two different sources. For Fairport, overall, it was about a little over $9 million. That's how it worked out for us. Now, one of the key pieces is that it was a 3-year funding availability that would end and no longer be available for school districts. So that's why you see here in orange, that's the influx of the federal funding that we received. So back in 2021-22, it supported many of the different programs we were able to enhance and offer and provide services to our students. And the supports as we transitioned out of the pandemic, very helpful for that as a school district, from reading supports, math supports, social emotional supports, many of those different pieces that we were able to bring in for services. 23-24 will be the final year that you would see that bar graph so high. And 24-25, which is the year we're in, is the first year that we do not have that funding. So we saw probably anywhere from, in the beginning, it was a little bit less that we supported, maybe around $2.5 million, and then utilized over $3 million in 2022-23, about $3 million in 23-24. So as we planned and built budgets, we had to look at how can we phase off of this reliance on that federal funding. So we saw great years, right? We saw the foundation aid phase in and stimulus funding all coming in at once for the school. Temporary, and then try to adapt and adjust in 24-25 for those funds no longer being available. So there's some of the different pieces and factors that we think about. The other sources you see up there that have been there throughout the years, we have other state aid. That would be like, it's recorded in our special aid fund. It would be related to the UPK programming. So it's a state source of funding. Essentially, the 3 and the 4 is the first 2 numbers determine whether it's state or federal. So that's a state source of funding. And then the 4,000s are federal sources of funding. NCLB, more known today as ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. That is, picks up our title grant funding. So we have Title I, which supports reading and math supports. We have Title II for PD, Title III for ELL programming, our English language learners, and then Title IV being the 4 title grants that fall within that red bar as a whole. So that, you can see those funding streams have been, saw a little increase in some years, fairly stable for the most part of where we've seen that. Now, in some years where you see not as much use, it may have meant we had carryover funds that may have been carried over to the next year and utilized the following year. So you can do that and manage it through the grants. And then the inter-fund transfer piece, there's a local share for special ed extended school year programming that is supported from a transfer of the general fund over the special aid fund, because that's where all the expenses take place between instructing students, transportation related to the extended school year program takes place in the summer. So that's a look at our special aid fund revenue. Again, not recorded in the general fund, but an important piece as we think about the areas that these funds for the stimulus funding were able to support as we look at budgets and sustainability of programs and services long term. Questions on the general fund revenue, special aid fund revenue? So again, just a pause if anyone had questions, or I know it's a lot of data and information. If you think of one, we can go back. Don't hesitate to stop me.
So we're gonna take a 5-minute break, and we're gonna come back and look at reserves and how we use reserves, and of course, this information is all in play too, because there's a lot of information if you want to come back and talk about different things related to what we were just talking about, foundation aid, our major source of funding, and how we rely on it, by all means. So we'll take a strict 5-minute break. So we want to get through the program and make sure that we get you out of here on time.
So what we did, so Mr. Provenzano, I believe, just passed out the reserve plan that we have. So before we jump into, some of the different summary pieces of our reserves and look at some charts, we just wanted to give you a minute to take a quick look at it, review any questions you may have. How long, do you want to just give a?
Yeah, I mean, take about 3 to 5 minutes to look over the reserve fund plan that's reviewed each year by the Board of Education and confirmed by the board as a whole. It's looked at an audit and finance committee, which 3 board members serve on, and if the changes made, say reflected in this document, but it's looked at each year. So please take a moment to review it. How do you want to do it?
hopefully that was enough time just to kind of take a look through the reserve fund plan. Before jumping forward, what do you notice the different reserves, questions you may have about how the district may use them or the plan itself?
Were you aware that the district had reserves? That's, as a conversation starter?
Not the significant amount.
Yes.
So I guess one question I have is, some of these technology reserves seem like they were meant to expire, some of them 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and they still have a balance. How does that work?
So great question. So the capital technology reserves, coupled with capital building reserves and our capital bus reserves, those reserves themselves are voter approved in order to create the reserve, and then it establishes a method of funding. So within the proposition that gets approved by voters, it has a funding limit and a term. So what that term means is that we may no longer put funds into that reserve at the end of that term. We can still spend the money out of the reserve until it's gone, but no more funding can happen, whether or not you hit the limit. So you see, yes, you're right, there's some that had the term expired for those tech reserve, which is why you see an additional tech reserve in there, because in order for us to fund anything anymore, a new one would have to have been established by voters.
You just don't, the balance doesn't get rolled forward or anything?
So sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on the language we put in the proposition. If, depending on the balance within the reserve, you don't necessarily want it to roll forward into the new reserve because it takes away the maximum limit as a whole. So it can be interpreted that fashion. So if we know we have a plan in the short term to spend the funds, then we'll spend the funds down and then perhaps roll any more in, or in another, if proposing to use again. Technology is a little unique because usually we only try to use that on one-time purchases that are more long-term and not rely on those reserves to fund recurring costs. That you then have to define which reserve you're going to use the money from.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, it depends on the amount. Like if it's a few $1,000s and it's small, we may just roll it right in because it's going to be immaterial in terms of taking away from a funding that's going to last 15 years. So it just depends. Yeah, at the time the tech one was created, the dollar amount was a little bit higher that would have taken away. So
Yeah, they look like they stepped down as well.
Yeah. Question?
Can you speak a little bit to, I would guess as a school district, your TRS obligations exceed your ERS obligations,
Yes.
but your ERS reserve is larger than your TRS reserve.
It is. So the TRS reserve that was allowed to be created a few years back is capped at how much we can fund per year at 2% of prior year salaries, and then maxes out as to how much we can actually have in there. So we are at the cap regardless of what our obligation is. In terms of long-range planning for the employee retirement system reserve, we've made an effort to try to have approximately 3 to 4 times the amount in there to help with any potential cliff that could be coming down the road if we have to fund that pension cost entirely utilizing the reserve.
So TRS is teacher retirement system, ERS is employee retirement system. Teacher retirement system is our certificated employees, teachers, administrators. ERS is our essential workers or non-certificated employees. And we're obligated to pay the state each year to go into the pension system. And recently, they just allowed us to form the TRS to meet that obligation.
And we would argue that we believe that there should be less of a limit on the teacher retirement system reserve because that cost is more. It can be double, if not a little bit more than double, our employee retirement system cost. So in essence, we would have to rely on the employee retirement system reserve funds to help with any of the pension costs up to the bill of the ERS.
But we do have to each year, Matt, pay into that system.
Yep.
And it's like the mandate piece that we were talking about. That's it.
Yeah, if we remember back to the expense last week, for those that were here for the expense presentation, we had the different pension system costs that we have to pay in each year. So as it relates to the employee retirement system, our average contribution percent is about 15% of salaries. And then the teacher retirement system right now is at about approximately 10% of salaries. The only difference is that our salaries for certificated employees are much greater than those in terms of quantity and dollars than those non-certificated employees. So it works out to be, higher cost times those number of salaries for the district. Yeah, we'd like to see the limit raised for schools, but we're very grateful and thankful that the state has allowed us to fund teacher retirement system reserve to help with those costs. Yeah. We were allowed, the dollar amount approximately we were able to put in each year was about $800,000, and we were only able to put in about 400 this past year because we're at the limit. And the limit's based off a percent of salaries, so it's different for each school district. Great question, though. That hopefully answered your question there. So we'll just start again. Interrupt me if there's something that pops in your head. We'll kind of go through just some summary slides of these pieces. How and why do we keep reserves? Again, you can see on the cover page, overall, kind of the description, reasoning. Here's kind of a snippet from that. Schools are required to define the purpose, though, and there's only certain authorized reserves we're allowed to put in, that we're allowed to fund as a school. So these would be comparable across school districts in New York State. There may be some districts don't have based on needs or how funding takes place, or there may be districts that have all of the authorized reserves. But in essence, some of these different funds include, like I talked about before, capital reserves. These ones, as mentioned, are restricted for capital. So the purpose defined: bus purchases, technology improvements, and capital building projects. Those are the three reserves that we have had established over the years. Have to be voter approved in order to create these reserves. Then, by resolution on an annual basis, looking at year-end surpluses, if there are revenues over expenses for actuals, then we work with our Audit and Finance Committee, and then ultimately there has to be board approval in terms of how to utilize such funds. Also work with our external auditor to make sure we're following all the rules and requirements. They may have some recommendations as they see things happening in the future or even across other districts. They can help us determine what would be the best to support potential operating revenue shortage in the future, or increased costs without the revenue to support it. How do we help manage those pieces? So the capital project reserve, you can see here, kind of a note there. There's a requirement schools have imposed by the state. That's a independent review of our building conditions. It's called the Building Condition Survey. It's required to be done every 5 years by school districts, and that helps shape development of capital improvement projects. I've seen in the past where states will look at the submissions for projects, they'll look at designs, and they may look back at the building condition surveys and see something that was identified as a critical improvement. And if that's not in the project, they may say, we want to see that in the project compared to X, Y, or Z. So you need to make this critical improvement before we move forward with the approval of the specifications for this project. So it's important. It helps the state as well for long-range planning in terms of what could be coming down the line for supporting schools looking for building aid, because that's part of the state's budget, to make sure that they're funding the building aid that schools, the capital improvement projects are driving for schools. So capital projects aren't just put together because somebody wants some kind of improvement. There's thought behind it, the building condition survey, and then we use the reserve to try to help offset that local share. As reviewed earlier, there's a building aid ratio. So when we're aided 70% on a dollar, there's 30% of the cost that we have to pick up. If we can make some down payments before we have to go out to borrowing for debt, then we can reduce that debt, principal and interest over the years, try to align that with the building aid payments. You can see in the plan, we have funded the reserve and we have gotten approval to take out of the reserve. So trying to turn that back around and give it back to taxpayers, and it helps lower that impact. If you take a look in the plan, you'll see we're in the process of developing a K through 8 building capital improvement projects, of which we would anticipate capitalizing on this money that's in the reserve to try to help keep that impact minimal to no additional impact after the aid. Then our tech reserve, here you've got 2022, and then as mentioned before, 2005, of which we can't put any more funds into it. The 2022 is there to fund. And then our bus reserve, same situation, expired, but has the funds in there. You'll see in the plan, and if you remember voting at the polls, back in May, there was a proposition to utilize $620,000 out of that reserve to support the purchase of 3 buses, which meant that $620,000 was not in the general fund. With approval, we were able to buy those and have that paid for by the reserve and not through a tax increase. Here's a few other reserves. These are restricted, established by resolution as a whole. A repair reserve, this would be any emergency repairs that could come up. Water main break. It could be, we've had, the material's Cal-Wall, but if you picture that translucent material that's around gymnasiums up high, we've had that blow off in a windstorm and out 3-4 feet, swinging and hanging. If districts don't have an open capital project or funds available, those things aren't typically budgeted for in the general fund. So this would help pay for stuff like that. It does require a public hearing to spend it and not have to put money back in. If districts didn't have a public hearing before spending it, they would just be required to pay that reserve back what was taken out. And then we have the employee benefit accrued liability reserve. This can be used to pay for, we'll call them separation pay. So whether it's a resignation, retirement, it could pay for any compensated absences that are due that employee upon separation from the district. So it could be vacation days accrued. It could be if there's a contractual requirement to pay out for any remaining sick days or capped up to an amount, we can utilize this reserve to pay for that. That's beneficial perhaps in a year that in the general fund, if we're only budgeting $300,000 for those types of payments and we have a large retirement year, that could help offset that difference between 300 and maybe it comes in at 400 or 500. So it's available for that. And then tax tertiary reserve, that is there to pay for Article 7 settlement. So essentially, companies that submit in some tax claims that are long-term, arguing Article 7 that they should be assessed lower. Those proceedings can take several years. So we have some funds in our tax cert reserve should there be settlements or the assessor's office comes to an agreement, with the arguing party and their counsel. We don't budget our full exposure here because typically they will argue that the assessment should be 10% of what it is. And knock on wood, it typically does not come in at 10% of that value. So they go through a process of determining what the proper assessment is, and it's mostly commercial properties. So liability reserve and insurance reserve, kind of two in the same. Essentially, anything that could be related to legal action or something not covered under insurance, these reserves may be used for those one-time expenses when they've had to happen. And we've had to use these reserves in the past just for some one-time larger expenses that may have taken place during a year.
I can recall publications talking about overcalculation of reserve funds where entities would essentially appear to bury money in a reserve fund rather than make it part of the operating expenses, operating income and expenses to defer tax, to lower tax rates. And again, I may just be picking up pieces of the thing, but it's kind of like, what's his name, DiNapoli will come in with his folks and take a look and audit
Mhm.
your books. How aggressive is the state? Is the state aggressive, or, and maybe you can't even make a comment in a
No,
general setting about
So we actually went through a comptroller's audit recently, and we had a conversation about reserves. And we said, here are our reserves. You can review them. We've been told they're prudent to have. We also have this influx of foundation aid and stimulus funding, and it's all going to go away. How are we going to sustain ourselves long-term without having some reserves to consider reliance on to soften the impact? So you'll see, if you look in some of the comptroller recommendations, they will recommend that districts have reserves for unanticipated costs.
So Matt, we also have, yes, and we've also given back to the community with our capital reserves, right? I mean,
Yep.
so I think that, so if we just sit on the capital reserves and they're not using them, right? They don't like that, right?
Right.
Which is the purpose is if you have them, you got to give them back to the community. And Mr. Stevens talked about capital projects that we've invested in, that we put reserve utilization in, from the transportation department that was just built a few years ago to capital project 2023. You're going to be hearing about another capital project, how we're going to use dollars to offset. So that $15 million that's in there is going to be given back to the community to make it a no additional cost to the taxpayer. And then we talk about the investment in our schools and how they're used, and all the useful life of goods and service, or the goods that we have, or the physical plant that we have here. We really try to maximize that. So
Yeah, it's a great point, right? The capital, especially the capital building reserves, right? If you see funds sitting in there for 10 years, it means you're not looking at trying to utilize and give those monies back. Unless there were votes that were just not approved over the years, then you're not authorized to spend the money, because in the vote, it will state project not to exceed X dollar with this amount of money in million coming from this reserve, this from this reserve. If the project gets voted down, we can't take those monies out. So those ones are voter approved, the capital ones, voter approved to create and establish the funding authorization. We fund it through resolution with the board, but in order to spend it, also has to be voter approved on those reserves. So we're not just taking we won't just be taking this money out without it being very clear and communicated through a voter approval process for voters. And the goal is to give it back. I mean, it's to help for lessening impact for some of those different pieces. Yep. Great question, though. There have been comptroller's reports that will talk about the reserves and, the opinion of the levels that districts have. And here's some other board authorized reserves. Again, restricted for the purpose. And these ones are reserves that may be used to help support operating expenses. So we have a workers' comp cost for insurance. We have unemployment costs that can vary each year depending on the year. And then we have the pension system costs for employee retirement system and then teacher retirement system. Both, the TRS one is a sub-fund of the employee retirement contribution reserve. That's why you see them both named the same between the two there. So these are reserves that, if you look within our budget, we do budget an amount to spend out of the reserve. If revenues come in exceeding expenses, then we do not have to use the reserves. However, we do budget and plan. And one of the pieces there is because ultimately schools cannot exceed their budget once approved by voters. There are some pieces that would allow districts to amend a budget through donations or grants or some of those different pieces, but ultimately, we are limited at staying within the overall budget itself. So if expenses exceed, we have areas like we could have areas of special education programming where we have move-ins into the district. We want to make sure we're budgeting for those costs, some of those different pieces that may or may not come to fruition throughout the fiscal year. So then there could be areas where we see on the revenue side, some revenues come in higher. Talked before about interest earnings. When those rates start to drop though, we have to decide, are we going to adapt the budget for that potential decrease in future years? Or are we going to move with the revenue itself, which will create spikes on the revenue side of the budget? So here's a kind of look over the years of the fund balance and reserves, and you can see there have been some years where funds have been spent, and then there are years where reserves have grown, particularly in the capital reserve area. That's one that has fluctuated over the years. Since I've been here, we have, there was the roofing project back in 2015 that used about $5 million of the capital reserve. There was the transportation building that used about $3 million of the reserve. The project that involved the multi-use turf field and the science classroom reconstruction here at the high school, secure vestibules across all of our buildings, boiler replacement, that used $7 million in reserves. So we've continued to use that. And then more recently, which is not showing on this chart because of just the timing in the year, is the project that involves the science, tech, engineering, arts, and math addition here at the high school and the new track. Between those two, 20 million of those reserve monies will be coming out. So that purple will drop because of that expense that took place in 23-24. So that transfer from the reserve to the capital fund took place last year. And then the other piece is that the green bar, and back in 2018-19 is when we were authorized to fund a teacher retirement system reserve.
Do you basically expect that to grow over time?
It can't grow any more than where it is right now unless the salaries
Gotcha.
are higher. So we were only able to fund it 400,000 approximately, so about half of what we put in previous years. And I think I put it in the reserve in terms of the plan, in terms of what the cap is. It's 2% of salaries each year. And then, let's see here. Oh, I don't have it in there, but I believe it's 4% of 4% of total salary, or a little bit higher than that total. It's about $4.5 million that we're capped out at right now.
That's
So
the maximum?
That's the maximum we're able to have in that. Yep. Or 4.9 million. Sorry, it's right there. 4.9. So again, that's just a look over the years. We haven't funded the employee benefit accrued liability. We haven't funded that anymore. We did create a workers' compensation reserve back in 2019-20. Again, that was pandemic time, and thinking about how can we be able to support stimulus money dropping off, foundation aid done being phased in, and workers' comp is an operating expense we have, and that could be used to support that piece. Unemployment insurance reserve, that has some funds in there, could help support staff retention in terms of the operating side of the budget. Those are some pieces that we've been advised that we can use those funds for in our long-term planning.
What is not expendable for?
Prepaid expenses. So it's insurance, basically, with the billing and how it works, our liability insurance. So, yeah, so it's not spendable, but it's a category of showing.
It's like dog-eared, it's already out the door.
Yeah, it's already out the door, you're right. Yeah, It's both, it's health insurance and liability because we essentially have, our fiscal year ends June 30, and we're providing insurance coverage for 10-month employees through the summer, right? So I carved out the operating ones. So that would be these four right here. So they're carved out right here, just a look at what those have been like over time. Again, like I mentioned, workers' comp established in 2019-20 and funded, and then the teacher retirement system reserve. And then additional funds put in unemployment, again, to plan for what could be coming down the road.
Mr. Stevens, I just want to say we're coming down the home stretch. We got about 3 minutes to keep everyone here, and I know that you're excited about these last 2 pages. Last slide. So you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Thanks. Just lost 30 seconds.
I know. I believe in you, though. I believe in you.
So we've seen revenues, expenses, right? Kind of talked through them the whole time we've been through here. How do they match up? Here's what it looks like over time. How are reserves funded, right? How do we have, surplus at year end? And that orange line and green line, you can see green line revenues for the district for general fund, orange line expenses. Where you've seen expenses a little bit higher than the revenues, those are times when we've had that transfer to our capital fund from the reserves. So it's going to show a higher expense. We didn't actually operate at a deficit in those years. There's only been 1 year that we've actually had to spend out of reserve, and I believe that was my first year, and it was a small amount. And then as we made a correction moving forward, worked hard to try to have that sustainability over time. So that's where the funding of reserves comes from, as well as assigning surplus from prior year to support the following year's budget. Those are the delta between those two of how those funds get used. And again, all communicated to the board by resolution so that it can be seen by the public, discussed. Usually it's done at the June board meeting, just to give an idea if you're ever looking for that information in terms of the allocation of funds. So next timeline, you've seen this slide before, but we continue to move through the process. We are at the 6th. On Tuesday, we have a presentation of the non-instructional portion of the budget. That involves the central office pieces, our non-instructional technology, buildings and grounds, transportation, benefits, those different pieces within the budget. We'll talk about Tuesday, then March 6th, talk about the instructional budget at the board workshop and present on that on the 18th. And then statewide, to adopt the budget by the statewide date, April 22nd is our board meeting. That's that week before it has to be adopted by the board. And then public hearing May 6th. That's 2 weeks prior to the vote. And then the vote, 3rd Tuesday in May every year. Budget vote and Board of Education election.
So this was just our attempt to invite you into the conversation, to share our process and what's under the hood and the revenues and expenses, and we hope that you found it beneficial. And as usual, we have the comments. There's a little Post-it note up there if you want to leave us a message, give us pearls of wisdom. We do take it to heart because we do want to hear from you, and we hope that you felt that we do want to invite you into our process, and hopefully next year we can continue to build on it. And by all means, if you ever want to come in and talk more about the budget, we'd be happy to do so. I would have to say, Mr. Stevens is one of the finest. Unfortunately, he will be leaving us in April 1st, and Mr. Nardone, Jeremy Nardone's here. He's going to be taking his position, so we'll be in good hands. But Mr. Stevens has been an incredible asset to our district, so we are grateful for his wonderful contributions, and he'll be going to BOCES, our neighbor, in a similar type position, in benefiting multiple different districts throughout the county in that role. So thank you, Mr. Stevens. Thank you, community members, and we'll be here for more questions if you choose to do so. Otherwise, thank you and drive safely.